A number of years ago, I created three related artists' books: Signal to Noise in 1998, Dry Reading in 1991, and Mars Observations in 2001. While each publication had its own identity, all three were built on similar design rules, and all books focused on, among other things, the visual relationship between text and image. Books were not intended to be read from cover to cover, but browsed as one might view a book of images or perhaps a product catalog. Rather than establishing a sequential narrative, they are structured more like music. Certain visual, textual, and conceptual themes are repeated throughout the entire publication, but each double-page spread also has its unique theme. The overall look of the books was inspired by technical publications, reference manuals, infographics, and textbooks. In most cases, the text was created algorithmically with custom software I wrote. The nature of the illustrations varied from book to book, and their look was dictated by what was allowed by the technology at the time. In 1985, several years before I made the first book, I did some experiments that became the prototype for the publications. I made a series of pieces, each on a single sheet of drawing paper with a Polaroid SX70 photograph attached in the middle. We had just purchased an Olivetti Praxis typewriter that produced beautiful, sharp, black letters, and I mail-ordered, sight unseen, an interface I saw advertised in a magazine that would attach to my Atari 400 computer and make it into a computer printer. What wasn't clear to me when I ordered it was that it required opening up our new typewriter and making dozens of solder connections. Fortunately, everything worked out. I had been learning some Unix commands which allowed me to search a dictionary for words having certain visual characteristics. Later, I'll show you an example of how I use programming to do this. Pictures were selected from a large supply of Polaroid images I had taken over the previous years. Here, all the words have double O's. In this one, all the words contain the letters S, H, O, and E. This one plays with the spelling rule, I before E except after C, and by the way, Ancient and Science violate this rule. Some of the pictures, like this one, were made with a homemade scanner. It consisted of a photocell attached to the carriage of our typewriter. The photocell was wired up to the game controller port of my Atari 400. The computer printed space and return characters to the typewriter to move the carriage. A program I wrote on the Atari then measured the amount of light reflecting off the picture at the point under the photocell. The text came from a computer terminal configuration file that was not intended to be human readable, but is still sort of beautiful. I found these pieces offered me enough information to help me plot my further inquiry. In 1985, Apple introduced the laser writer with PostScript. PostScript allowed printers to produce complex, sophisticated graphics, which, to that point, could only be done on much more expensive machines. I continued to make one-page experimental pieces, but this time using the laser writer for output. Here is a diagram explaining the relationship between the input words, in this case my name, and the output from the dictionary search. Again, I'll show you more about doing this in a bit. This one is a diagrammatic exploration of irrational numbers. It also plays with multiple interpretations of the word irrational. At that time, Aldous introduced PageMaker, a publication design program that allowed for what you see is what you get capability. In 1987, the University of Oregon, where I am currently a retired professor, had put into service a Linetronic image setter that could output high-resolution graphics on paper or film from PostScript files. The output was capable of being used for high-quality offset printing. Because I was already familiar with the technicalities of offset printing, I learned to use PageMaker and decided to make a book. Because I loved graphical programming as well as using tools like McPaint and McDraw, I developed a hybrid working method where some graphic elements were made through programming in Pascal and others were created directly with software programs. Keep in mind, this was before programs like Photoshop were available. Much of what I did required that it be done through programming. This was especially the case with anything that used randomness. Though it could be frustrating at times, I loved the process. I used programming to create blocks of words or phrases. Word searches were used to reveal patterns, and randomness was used to jumble text. Unlike later books, Signal to Noise also contained some text that was meant to be read and understood. Designing in PageMaker was unrefined by today's standards, but revolutionary at the time. One of the limitations being that the computer could only display pure black or pure white pixels. Here's what it looked like using the program at the time. Signal to noise was delivered to the printer on 3 floppy disks. One of the visual devices used throughout the books is to make graphical references to information containers. For instance, the signal to noise title words take a form similar to 35mm negatives, and the title page incorporates illustrations of other pages. It also allows for a fair amount of semiotic fluidity. For instance, the page numbers in the books are normally standard numerals, but occasionally are represented by dice. All 3 books are full of this kind of visual slipperiness. Here the text on the left page consists of unconnected sentences which seem to be extracted from a larger story or perhaps something overheard in a conversation. Sentences are randomly repeated and references to genders are randomly switched. Here's a sampling. His heart was pounding as he removed the shrink wrap. She saw them run across her lawn every day and had fantasies of fabricating intricate booby traps. He would sneak out and buy fried chicken whenever he could. She loved dancing but could do without the ridicule. On the facing page you will find more semiotic play. You will notice that the dog speech balloons contain the same pattern as their shadows. Here's the return of the shoe text. This time there's a diagram explaining the system. These 2 pages are among my favorite in the book. Most of what we see was made using a grayscale probability technique in which the odds of a pixel being either black or white depends on the gray value at that spot in the original picture. On the right-hand page, if we look closely, the block of text randomly repeats the words text and texture. To keep visual rivers from developing, which will happen whenever a word is repeated many times on a page, I had the program randomly repeat letters within the words. The pictures in this spread were also created with the grayscale probability technique. In 1989, I was on a panel at the College Art Association National Conference and presented a paper on signal to noise. The next year, my paper was published in their academic publication Art Journal. Images from signal to noise were also featured in a number of publications, including the journal Leonardo and the books Postmodern Currents, Art and Artists in the Age of Electronic Media by Margaret Lovejoy and The Computer in the Visual Arts by Anne Morgan Spalter. I printed 1,000 copies of Signal to Noise and currently only have about 15 left. Let's take a quick look at how I go about using programming to generate and modify text. I might start with a short program like this one that will search a dictionary and find words embedded in other words. There is no user interface. I make changes directly in the program because I'm the only one who uses it, and I'm always changing the code to make the program do what I want. Here I am asking it to search a dictionary for words that contain my first name and have the same number of characters. This is the result, and we find the word cigar. Now let's do the same for my last name. We find there are no matches. So let's tell the program that the words can have any number of characters. Here we see that there are a bunch of options, and one of which is the word Macintosh. The program also writes the words to disk where they can be processed by other programs that might do formatting, randomization, or a number of other things. I ended up creating many text files with interesting word or character relationships. Here's what a few of the files looked like. While made 3 years after Signal to Noise, dry reading retained the same basic physical appearance. It was 8.5 by 11 in size, 24 pages in length, and printed on the same paper. Technology had advanced a bit, but most of the limitations were still in place. Adobe Photoshop was released in 1990, but for my purposes, most of the graphics still needed to be programmed. Dry reading continued to use and expand on text processing algorithms. One new thematic feature of dry reading is that it included photographs and references from my childhood. Let's take a look at a few pages. The title font was modified through programming to have fuzzy pixelated edges. There is also a subtitle, through tough though thorough thought, which is fun to say and look at. The main illustration is a kind of connect the dots drawing. Like Signal to Noise, Dry Reading's title page contains an illustration of more pages. This page focuses on the home. Notice the various graphic interpretations of a house. While I was developing Dry Reading, I was also creating the KidPix drawing program, and some of my graphic experiments showed up in both. For instance, a couple of the house pictures were rendered using KidPix tools, as was the Connect the Dots portrait on the cover. The theme here is breath. A collection of phrases from literature using the word and concept of breath were selected and randomly combined to build a text. The picture is of my mother as a child. Here we find my third grade report card and a grade school picture. This page combines a fictional font, a juxtaposition of the words garble and gargle, and a couple of odd self-portraits. Here we find more self-portraits. The self-deprecating text is, ironically, the star here. Here are a few of the sentences. These words are here only for the purpose of improving the overall look of the page. This text is only here for decorative purposes. You may as well go back to whatever you were doing before you started reading this text. This text has no meaning. These words are pointless. No one will ever care what this text says. There is no point in reading this text. Dry reading had some success, but due to the publication of KidPix, which became the focus of much of my professional life, it never received the distribution that Signal to Noise did. I waited another 10 years before making Mars observations. By that time, software tools were more sophisticated, and designing publications digitally was the norm. Mars observations continued most of the themes of the previous books, and this time graphic content was photographic. Pictures on any given spread had a tight visual and content relationship. Mars observations did depart from previous publications a bit physically. While it was still 8.5 by 11 in size, it was printed in color and perfect bound, not stapled. It was also appreciably longer at 64 pages. While I haven't mentioned it up to now, all three publications lived a second life in the form of prints for exhibition. They were output at 130% and displayed as double-page spreads. In fact, they were probably the work I've exhibited most because they fit into so many categories, including digital art, photography, and artist books. The Mars Observations publication doubled as a catalog for a show at the Marylhurst University Art Gym. The publication contained an essay by Terry Hopkins, the art gym director. Let's take a look at a few pages from Mars Observations and see how text and image relate. First, the cover. At the top, we see that the words art gym are embedded in the words mouth-wateringly and hyperstimulating. The remainder of the text consists of the word Mars alternating with a word that has the word Mars embedded in it. On the back cover, there is a diagram explaining the system. If you read the text out loud, it has an interesting rhythmic poetic quality. Then on the left title page, the same strategy is employed using the word observe. And on the right title page, we see our old friend Cigar Macintosh. On this page, we revisit our list of words from the early pages that incorporate double O's. Mars Observations also contains a number of pages using graphic stand-ins for text. There are also a number of pages that use blocks of symbols or other characters to refer to text. Remember the paper I wrote on Signal to Noise that was published in Art Journal? Well, here it is republished in Mars Observations. This time, it was passed through a novelty program I wrote called D- that mangles spelling and applies the rules of spelling in reverse. It is then rendered in a font based on my handwriting. I developed a new algorithmic method for generating text not found in the earlier books. I started by visiting thematic websites and copying the written material. In this case, it's a website about weather. I would then remove all extraneous characters and spaces and would get a block of text like this. The words would then be randomized and the results searched for phrases that seem poetic or made some sort of vague sense. Here are several pages using this technique. The text on this page was made from writing found on two websites, one selling lighting supplies and another dealing with physics. Here are a few of the phrases it came up with. On this page, if you look closely, you will find the source of the title of Mars Observations. In 2018, I was visiting New York and stopped into Printed Matter, the premier bookstore focusing on selling artist books. I was surprised and delighted to see Mars Observations featured 17 years after it was published. That's a look at 3 books. All books have many more things going on in them than I can talk about here. If you would like to find out more, visit my website, dryreading.com. Thanks for watching.